thank you very much for including me in.
Okay.
Does the video first?
For some migrants, the road north starts deep in Central America. Their first destination is the southern border of Mexico. From there, they make their way up to one of the towns near the border with the United States. These small towns have become staging areas for migrants as they prepare for their trek into the U.S. to link up with either family members or employers. The journey is dangerous. Bandits, loan sharks, and corrupt police prey on them. And then there are the physical dangers. Many migrants travel north by freight train.
And when they jump on trains, sometimes they'll stow away in a boxcar. Sometimes they'll hide themselves in between the train cars. It's very dangerous for 15, 16, 17 hours at a time, just holding on to a train, holding on for their dear life. A lot of immigrants, sometimes just because of sheer exhaustion, sometimes fall off the train. They'll lose a foot, they'll lose a leg, they'll lose an arm. A lot of them will fall off and inevitably die.
In an award-winning photo series, LA Times photographer Don Bartletti rode the rails north through Mexico with the migrants. He photographed moments of fear, joy, adventure, and compassion.
In Veracruz, there are people who live on the trackside who throw food at the migrants riding atop the freight train. There was one small little mom-and-pop grocery store next to the tracks in Orizaba, where a teenage boy had taken the leftover fruit from the market. And I thought that this boy was going to toss the oranges and they would catch them like playing baseball. But at the last second, he lunged towards the freight car with these guys and their arms hanging out. But through my viewfinder, all I saw was the blurred motion of the train going by. I didn't see the most magic picture of my trip. Two hands touching, the migrants and the gift givers. Just a brief brush, as if they were each communicating without words, saying, please go with God, go with peace, go with luck. And the migrant on the northbound freight train saying, thank you for this gift of food.
The life of the migrant is a lonely experience. Will I fall off the train? Will I be robbed or swindled? What will happen at the border? These are just a few of the questions these men think about.
There's one very special photograph in my series, Bound to El Norte. It's a picture of Santo Antonio Gamay holding on to the sides on the end of a rail car. I was laying on top of the adjoining boxcar, looking straight down. Took one picture, and then he opened his mouth. The emotion came directly through the camera, into my heart, into my soul. And Santo told me, I'm going to Canada, where I have a job as a painter. And I said, well, what were you thinking when you were holding onto the train car? And I was yelling at him because it's still noisy. He says, I was praying to my Savior. Let me pass this time.
After days of traveling on trucks, buses, and trains, for some migrants, the road north starts deep in Central America. Their first destination is the southern border of Mexico.
Let me start again. Thank you very much, Bishop Sanchez-Rondo, and for including me in your program. I'm just going to have some brief remarks focusing on three areas: dignity, integration and development, and partnerships and dialogue. Before I begin on that, however, I think it was really important what was said last session in relation to this terminology that's being used and trying to get away from this notion of a crisis. I think we have a humanitarian crisis all along the routes and in the Mediterranean, where today we surpassed 1,500 deaths this year already. And we have a political crisis as well, and perhaps a crisis of leadership. But that crisis of leadership and political, I think, is in part a result of other underlying problems, national problems, that aren't being addressed. And in this context, migrants and refugees are unfortunately becoming easy scapegoats and easy targets. The concept of dignity, I think, is critical when discussing migration issues. And it really ties into all of the actions that are necessary to improve the situation. Whether it is indeed saving lives or and eliminating needless loss of life, or identifying those who are most at risk and providing assistance, eradicating trafficking and slavery. Dignity ties into all of these actions. And I think the lack of the dignity, the lack of human understanding of what these people are going through is also one major contributing element to the very negative perception that this whole issue has taken and how toxic it has become. In fact, one of the reasons that we're facing all of these challenges is that the situation has been mismanaged by states. We have globalized everything. We're living through a technological revolution. We can move faster and more cheaply than ever before, and yet we expect to use the same instruments that we have had since just after the Second World War to govern migration. And I think this is really what we're being confronted with right now. And whether we're talking about the migration that we just saw on the video from Latin America to the US, or the Mediterranean, which is quite different context but similar issues. Really, it's the absence of comprehensive migration and asylum policies that have left a lot of states, in this context right now, industrialized states, ill-prepared to deal with this issue. And we have the appearance of chaos and disorder, which feeds into fear, and it's a very, very vicious cycle, because as we can't get the situation to ameliorate, the fear perpetuates itself. Now, in all of this, the underlying issue, certainly in the European context, is legal channels. But I would say that globally, legal, safe, orderly channels are fundamental. The reality is that the vast majority of the people that are coming across the Mediterranean today, and have been for years, have no other way to move safely. They have no legal alternatives. Only about 20,000 have been resettled in almost 2 years. And for the rest of them, there's just no opportunity to make their way to safety, to better livelihoods, to economic opportunities, other than to rely on traffickers and smugglers. So when we're talking about safe legal channels, we're talking about protection, we're talking about, indeed, eliminating the need for criminals and middlemen that are managing these flows in the absence of anything else. And I think we need to talk about also corridors for all different types of mobility, long-term, short-term, for protection and for economic reasons, temporary and permanent. And these two will help alleviate also some of the pressure on, indeed, some of the humanitarian corridors. Allowing for this to happen, again, I think we need the concerted effort and much, much more collaboration on a bilateral and multilateral level than we're currently seeing. We also have a situation where basically we're confronted with extremely difficult integration issues right now. Again, this is more evident when we have large number of arrivals, and particularly when they're irregular, and therefore in Europe right now this is very much accentuated. But I don't want what I'm saying to suggest that these numbers are somehow of some enormous magnitude that can't be managed. Even in 2015, when just over 1 million migrants and refugees reached Europe, that represented 0.2% of the European population. Just to give you an idea, I know it's very different because it's done in a very orderly way, but every year Canada takes almost 1% of its population through refugees and migrant channels. So the notion that the European Union, a continent that has a union that has 500 million people and most of the richest countries in the world can't get a handle on this is simply unbelievable. The concept of integration is easy. Migrants cannot contribute to the societies they live in. They can't reach their maximum potential if their welfare is not ensured. And they simply cannot participate effectively in society if they're marginalized and excluded. And this is all types of inclusion: social, cultural, economic, and political life. So it's the integral development that will lead to the full realization of human development. On the partnerships, I would just like to say a few words because I think it's really critical at this time for a variety of different actions that are necessary, and also leading into the discussions and negotiations of the Global Compact. But before I get into that, in a very concrete and operational context, partnerships are more important than ever. We are seeing new innovative ways to get people the protection they need through humanitarian corridors, through public-private partnerships and sponsorships, not only in Canada, but ones that have been tried elsewhere in Europe as well. There is an excellent initiative that was spearheaded in Italy by Sant'Egidio and its partners, which is now expanding to include Oxfam and Caritas, and basically moving people from harm's way to safety in a way that obviously has the support of governments, but is largely run by these associations and these organizations, and is also by and large self-funded. So taking some of the burden off the governments and moving a lot of the responsibility over to the communities. These are excellent examples. We also need to work on new countries on resettlement, and we've started a program in IOM to basically have emerging countries join in these efforts. And Argentina has come forward recently with a pledge of quotas to move people from the Middle East to Argentina. So I think we have to look for innovation, and I think for that to happen, we need a lot more collaboration. We are heading into a very, very difficult period. I think it's one that has incredible opportunities. The Global Compacts represent an opportunity of more than a lifetime, I think, in trying to do something very meaningful, both on the refugee side and on the migration side. But unfortunately, I think that we have extremely strong headwinds in the political arena. And I think that some of the commitments that were made even only last fall would be difficult to reach even today, given how some elections have gone across the Atlantic, but also on this side of the Atlantic. So all the more reason for very, very strong collaboration and partnership. Just to give you a more concrete example in that regard, I've been working a little bit on the G7 process, which Italy has the presidency of this year. And basically the G7 countries, who for decades have shared common values and principles, couldn't even agree to a most basic statement on mobility. So it concerns me very much that 7 industrialized countries who really don't have issues with each other on these issues can't come to a consensus. I think it's going to be extremely challenging going forward. On this, I think we do need to work a lot more also on the understanding and the perception of the issue. This is critical at the community level. I think the community leaders, church leaders have an enormous role in this. I think they also have an enormous role in basically preparing the ground for communities that inevitably are going to receive migrants and refugees to host them. Integration is a very complicated two-way street where, with a lot of different actors on it that move at different speeds, and we absolutely must pay more attention to the host communities if we're going to be more successful. I think I'll stop there, and thank you again.